Now, Martin, I think we should start with this peculiar situation with drones. So apparently an American drone got lost 6,000 miles away from America over the Straits of Hormuz yesterday.
Well, I mean, the Iranians claimed that it was in their airspace, and the Yanks claimed that it wasn't. So you've got two conflicting reports there.
So is it okay to shoot down a drone? Anyway, we've heard,
if it's in your airspace, you're entitled to shoot it down.
The Americans were saying,
of course, if there are any rules, those are the rules.
They were about to do airstrikes against surface-to-air missile sites, several of them, and Trump was told, and he's admitted this now, he was told apparently about 120 people would die, so he decided he wouldn't do that.
Well, what happens, of course, if you kill 150 Iranians, they're likely to shoot back. This is what happened because the chemical weapons attack at Douma last year turned out to be a fake, and then Britain fired British cruise missiles into Syria, and fortunately they took the view that they weren't going to fire back. They could have fired back. They'd have been in their rights to do so, wouldn't they? Especially since it was a fake attack.
OK, so what about exactly what's going on over there now? Because we're told that there was a decision by Trump not to actually do the attack. Why no reference to the UN Security Council? You can't just go hitting a country.
Well, in actual fact, there's no reference to the US Congress either. In actual fact, in the US Constitution, it's only the Congress that has the power to declare war. Now, what's happened in what they call the imperial presidency is that over the years, the president has basically taken over that war declaring power, and nobody really pays any much attention to the rules anymore. Perhaps they ought to. I mean, what you're pointing out what the rules are in this situation, but they are basically arguing on the basis of we don't care about the rules. We're just going to do what we want.
President Putin,
what we want to do.
He had his annual, it's a 4-hour press conference with members of the press from all over Russia and other parts of the world. I mean, including Ukraine. I noticed there were some Ukrainians in there too. He says a war between the United States and Iran would be a catastrophe. It would lead to an increase of violence and potential increase in refugees from the region, Putin said. It could have sad consequences for those who attempt it.
Well, I mean, that's common sense stuff, but we're teetering on the brink of this. Meanwhile, as we stare at our own navels in Britain, you feel like asking the two candidates for Prime Minister, what is your view on World War III before we decide whether we're going to... we're not going to get to vote for them, but, we're actually on the brink here of something happening. And nobody's paying much attention.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about this is these various things, it seems to be ramping up, doesn't it, in terms of the tankers. I think it was it 5 tankers initially attacked, only very lightly, and then we had 2 tankers last week, much bigger missile attacks. Interestingly, come to light, I mean, we didn't cover it on last week's show, the tanker attack of the Norwegian and the Japanese tankers, both of which were quite severely hit by... looks now like by missiles. That's what the crew on the Japanese ship said anyway, that actually the British SBS Special Boat Service were deployed to Oman, which is the part of the coast where it looks these missiles came from, that direction anyway, that was where the boats were hit, just 3 weeks before this attack. Who are the Special Boat Service, and is it possible they might have carried this attack out?
All right, 2 questions. The Special Boat Service are the Royal Marines version of the SAS, so they're more amphibious. And could they have carried out such an attack? Possibly, but I tend to think that what happens with these kind of false flag attacks is they try to create as much plausible deniability as possible, so that you wouldn't necessarily use a regular SBS unit to do it. People from that unit might be seconded to do it, but they wouldn't do it as an SBS unit as such. That would be my guess, but I'm only guessing.
Well, one of the things that's also come out because of this attack, at least it's been revealed in the Daily Express, is Iran's top-secret weapon, which will stop any US invasion attempt in its tracks. Iran has a weapon that could be potentially catastrophic for the US, using that same word as Putin used, should conflict break out between the two countries, an expert has stated. The weapon is, in fact, an electromagnetic pulse weapon. Tensions between Iran and the US have neared breaking point over the last few weeks. This electromagnetic pulse weapon, Martin, would leave all the US troops, according to this Daily Express article, unable to even communicate. They would knock out planes. Planes would just simply fall out of the sky. What is this weapon?
Well, if you remember, the USS Donald Cook was in the Black Sea about 2 years ago now, and the Russians it was in a part of the sea that the Russians didn't want it to be in their territorial waters. So they flew missions at it. They knocked out all of its electronics. It's basically a spy ship. So they knocked out all of the electronics, and then they ran various dummy bombing runs at it just to show what they could do. If it comes to a shooting war in the Gulf, a full-on shooting war, both sides are going to deploy all sorts of stuff. And I wouldn't claim to be an expert on all of this.
Okay, writing in the American Spectator, geopolitical analyst Brandon J. Vexert said Iran has devastating electromagnetic pulse weapons which could be devastating for the US. Could incapacitate the technological US invasion force before they could even damage Iran.
Well, if you think about it, if you're a smaller player like Iran taking on a technologically superior enemy like the US, then you go after their electronics. That's the weak point, isn't it? You try and make sure that you don't rely upon electronics because they do, and if you can knock their electronics out, then they're fighting blind and you're not.
Way back in 2014, I interviewed a guy from Cheltenham, a scientist, Norman Ellis, who's written, apparently, the book on electromagnetic pulses. It's called the Electrical Interference Handbook. Norman lived. He died just after I interviewed him, actually, in Prestbury, just on the outskirts of Cheltenham, with this rather peculiar chap who lived next door to him, who sort of seemed to be spying on us as we were going in and out of the house. But anyway, this is what Norman had to say about these electromagnetic pulse weapons.
If you happen to let it off at 35k above the Earth's surface...
Well, that's 35,000 feet, yeah.
Yes, sorry. It generates an enormous electrical field in the air due to the molecules rushing about, if you like, as the explosion occurs. And this field is so enormous that it can damage things like television sets. It'll do it over a radius of up to about 1,000 miles from the centre of impact. Now, when the explosion occurs at that height, you're unlikely to hear very much. You won't suffer from a blast effect. You might see a twinkle in the sky, but that's about it. But the major effect will be electronic. And for modern defence systems used by the Army, Navy and Air Force, of course they rely on communications. Now, if that event happened there, unless they use protected equipment, then they could be damaged, and therefore they lose the capability of communication.
That's not the only thing that gets knocked out, is it, Martin? Everything pretty much would grind to a halt. Cars, things like that. This studio, I don't think anything would work if there was an electromagnetic pulse weapon used.
Well, I understand.
Within 1,000 miles of us, Norman is saying.
I understand that the Russians have very definitely developed this sort of stuff. I've no idea how you'd deploy it because, of course, if you did something like that, you'd possibly destroy your own electronic communications. So if you were going to use it, you'd have to find some way of either protecting your own electronic communications or communicating non-electronically.
But I suppose what the Iranians are thinking is, well, you're way, way away from your country. You're 6,000 miles away from America, and this is our territory, and if we want to set this off, we will, and that will leave your boats just sitting in the water, your airplanes just gliding. They'll become gliders, won't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, and if you're going to use such a weapon, I would argue that you've got to be prepared, that you're prepared to fight on after such a thing has happened.
I mean,
you've got to be able to either protect your own electronics by, using some casings or something like that, or you just rely. I mean, before electronic warfare, people used to just rely upon, sophomore.
Would a B-52 bomber just slowly start to become a glider as all the engines switch off, and then go into a spiral dive with a nuclear bomb on it?
Well, presumably that's exactly the effect that you're looking for, isn't it? I mean, the problem with high tech is it's high tech. I mean, the Iraqi resistance worked this out years ago, and they basically went very, very low tech. Don't use mobile phones. They used these 5-volt batteries to set off the bombs, which all this expensive electronic warfare equipment can't detect. And they relied upon whispering to people and writing things down on bits of cigarette paper and swallowing them afterwards. And that's how you do it if you're fighting a high-tech enemy, because they can't do that stuff. How long until the unthinkable happens with Iran, Martin? Because it does seem as if in
in this last year of Donald Trump's presidency, there is some sort of determination to actually kick something off?
Well, I think Bolton and Pompeo and all those lot are definitely keen for something to happen.
Who are the various forces involved here?
Well, I mean, inside the US administration, you've got a very strong hawkish faction. And Trump has got one foot in their camp, and he's also got another foot in the other camp, because, of course, if it all goes horribly wrong, he will get the blame. And he's not very keen on that. And it looks like he has basically decided, I mean, we're all dependent upon what goes on in his brain cells.
I mean, if those several
it's a scary thought.
If those several surface to air missile batteries had been destroyed yesterday, what would be the consequences today?
Well, what the Iranians could easily do is say, you do that to us, that's an act of war. First thing we're going to do is sink all your ships in the Gulf. We're going to sink them all. I mean, this is what could have happened last year with Britain firing cruise missiles based in Akrotiri at the Syrians. The Syrians chose to suck it up, but they could have decided to fire back and basically kill as many people as they possibly could at RAF Akrotiri. And then, of course, the British government says, we've lost 200 of our people. Yes, but you started the war. The other side aren't always going to take the view that we're not going to fire back. And, of course, what may happen at a certain point is Soleimani or some of the more hardline generals in the Iranian side are going to say, right, we've had enough now. It's time to punch them on the nose. Bullies never back down until you punch them on the nose. Let's punch them on the nose. And, of course, that means lots of blood.
Another actor involved here, of course, is Israel. Israel's secretive nuclear facility leaking as Watchdog finds Israel has nearly 100 nuclear weapons. Israel is one of only 5 nations in the world that refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, an international treaty aimed at ending the proliferation of nuclear weapons and achieving global nuclear disarmament. So apparently the Israelis have got twice as many nukes as was first thought, 100 of them.
Well, I was under the understanding they had 200, but it doesn't really make much difference. It's enough to make an awful big bang.
Well, Colin Powell apparently said 200 years ago, but lots of people denied that.
Well, I mean, the fact is the Israelis have got nuclear weapons. They're not supposed to have them. They basically stole the material from the Americans, which is why Jonathan Pollard was sent to prison in the US as a spy, because he'd sold them the material. And the plans and everything. They're not supposed to have them. Under the Logan Act, any country that develops nuclear weapons illegally should be put under immediate sanctions by the US. So that's why the Israelis won't admit that they've got them directly, because if they do, the Logan Act would possibly kick in, which means they've got to be put under full sanctions like North Korea or somewhere like that. I mean, Israel is a rogue state. And Martin von Creveld, who's a sort of defence intellectual over there, wrote, he said some years ago, what the Western powers have got to understand is that we have got nuclear weapons, and if they try and push us around, we can hit Rome, we can hit Berlin, we can hit Paris. That's what he's threatening.
If you're an EU citizen living in the UK, you will need to apply to the EU settlement scheme. This means that the rights you currently have will be protected after the UK leaves the EU. The scheme is fully open, and you have plenty of time to apply. It is free. To find out more and to apply, visit gov.uk/EU settlement scheme. Irish citizens or those with valid indefinite leave don't need to apply.
We'll be talking about Israel's role in 7/7 in a minute, or at least alleged role. But first, in the Conservative leader debate at the BBC on Wednesday, which, by the way, was a bit shambolic. I don't know if you saw it, Martin, but there was lots and lots of people talking over each other. And I think the BBC might be talking about eventually sacking the producer of that programme, because it wasn't sort of carved out properly so that each person had an opportunity to say something. It was a kind of free for all. But anyway, the point being here on this topic is that the Bristol contingent put in a question to the debate about Islamophobia, and that's about 4.5 minutes long. The answers, quite complicated and excellent question, and let's have a listen to that and their answers, the various candidates' answers. Now, obviously, we're mostly interested in the answers of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt.
We've got Abdullah waiting for us in Bristol. Evening, Abdullah. What's your question for the panel here?
Evening, Emily. Evening, gentlemen. I'm the Imam of a mosque, and I see firsthand the everyday impact of Islamophobic rhetoric on my community. Do the candidates agree that words have consequences?
do the candidates agree that words have consequences? Boris Johnson, in the past you've said Muslim women who wear veils look like letterboxes and bank robbers. Do you accept your words have consequences? You've just heard that from an imam.
Of course, and insofar as my words have given offence over the last 20 or 30 years when I've been a journalist and people have taken those words out of my articles and escalated them, of course I'm sorry for the offence that they have caused. But I would just say this to our friend from Bristol, that when my Muslim great-grandfather came to this country in fear of his life in 1912, he did so because he knew it was a place that was a beacon of generosity and openness and a willingness to welcome people from around the world. And
what would he think of you using those words then about the community? If I am Prime Minister, I will ensure that that is the way our country acts and behaves. And I may say that in respect of what my friend over there says, Abdullah.
Of course, what Abdullah says,
right.
Of course, I think my Muslim great-grandfather would have been astonished to have found that his great-grandson had become foreign secretary.
The question was, though, do you accept that
But he would have been very proud, and that would have been, I think, a tribute to this country.
Mr Johnson, do you accept that words have consequences? You are frequently careless with your language. Do you worry that you may do more harm than good? I'm going to raise the issue of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, and this was your comment. When I look at what Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was doing, she was simply teaching people journalism. As I understand it, you know what that did to her jail sentence in a Tehran jail.
Well, actually, I think it's very, very important, Emily, that in this context we should pay tribute to the work of the Foreign Office in doing what they can to get out very difficult consular cases. But in seeking to point the finger either at me or at anybody in the UK for the incarceration of Nazanin or anybody else, I have deepest sympathy clearly for Nazanin and her family. But in pointing the finger at our side...
Words have consequences. That was Abdullah's phrase.
At our side, well, actually, in that case, it didn't, I think, make any difference. But if you point the finger at the UK, all you are doing is exculpating those who are truly responsible, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
And when Donald Trump,
that is the reality, and people should realise what this regime is up to.
Okay,
and,
I'm going to ask
that is where our responsibility lies.
When Donald Trump retweets offensive, irascible comments about Londonistan, you say you don't like the language, but basically you agree 150% with the content of the tweet.
No. What I said was I agreed with his sentiment that Sadiq Khan has been a useless London mayor when it comes to tackling knife crime, but I totally disagree with his words, and I totally disagree with the racist rants of Katie Hopkins. And let me tell you why. I am married to an immigrant. I have 3 half-Chinese children. When they go to school, they look different to the other kids. And you know, the best thing about this country is it doesn't matter at all. Nobody says anything. We are one of the most open, outward-looking, tolerant countries on the planet. And we must do everything we can to preserve and protect that, particularly at the point of Brexit, where people worry that, I think wrongly, but they worry that somehow our culture might change. And I think we have to show people the Brexit that the Conservatives are going to deliver is a tolerant Brexit. We're not going to put the shutters down and say foreigners not welcome. We're going to remain that brilliant, welcoming country.
Sajid Javid, you've said you'd be happy
to
open up the Conservative Party to an independent investigation over allegations of Islamophobia. Would you like everyone on the stage who becomes our next Prime Minister, anyone, to commit to that?
Yes, I would. Do you all agree, guys? Should we have an external investigation of the Conservative Party into Islamophobia?
Absolutely.
So they all agree. Rory, do you agree?
Excellent.
They agree.
So that was Sajid Javid's comment on that particular item, Martin. But Boris is blaming the Iranian Revolutionary Guard for his comments about Muslims.
Well, he's just trying to evade the question. I mean, basically the questioner was saying, the perception that you speak first and think later. And, of course, he's just trying to evade the question that she's asked him. And, of course, he basically let the cat out of the bag that the woman in Iran was, in fact, training journalists when she was supposed to be there on a tourist visa. And, therefore, from the Iranian point of view, she's acting in a hostile fashion.
Well, I'm also joined by the former press officer a former press officer for South Yorkshire Police, Tony Farrell. Hi, Tony. Welcome to the Politics Show.
Hi, Tony. I wasn't the press officer. I was the principal intelligence analyst.
Principal intelligence analyst.
At
Okay.
South Yorkshire Police.
Could you give us your thoughts on this Tory leadership and also potentially, anyway, an investigation into Islamophobia in the Conservative Party? I know you've converted to Islam. Have you? When did you do that? No. You haven't.
Right.
All right.
No.
Okay.
Long story.
So, yeah,
two facts wrong in the first.
Not too bad. But
I have been away for a long time.
Just by your appearance, you've got a great long beard and you've got a nice little sort of hat on. So that's nothing to do with your
No,
faith.
it gets me. This changed appearance gets me arrested in Gibraltar on National Day, when
so it's
thousands of people dressed in red in the main square. And I look like a mad mullah from
Is it a sort of
Square.
disguise?
You look like something from Glastonbury.
Is it a disguise?
No, it's not a disguise, no.
You're just doing it for fun, okay. All right, so, what's your thoughts on what you've just heard anyway there?
Well, don't we think that it's rich coming from Boris, the master of spin? It's simply just not cricket. He's got words do count, and Boris has a habit of putting his foot in things. I can think of what he did in 2004 with The Spectator, when he lambasted Liverpudlians and mentioned Hillsborough.
So what did he just remind us about that? I mean, I certainly didn't know about it. What did he say?
He said, in talking about Liverpudlians in The Spectator, he said they see themselves whenever possible as victims and resent their victim status. He's talking about the Liverpudlians and the Hillsborough families who are pursuing justice. Yet at this same time, they wallow in it and describe it as a psychological state in Liverpool, which he subsequently had to go to Liverpool twice in order to profusely apologise for his inappropriate words.
Anyway, this Abdullah, this Imam who gave this question on the BBC leadership debate, Mr. Patel, he was criticised after for tweets from the past where he said every political figure, Martin, on the Zionist payroll is scaring the world about Corbyn. Now, is that an anti-Semitic tweet?
I wouldn't argue so. Some would say, but I wouldn't say. I would say that's fair comment. I mean, basically, we know that the Israeli embassy operates in a very active way in this country. We got the Al Jazeera sting where the Mossad officer said on camera, we've got £1 million to spend in the Labour Party to get the results we want. And then people say it's anti-Semitic to say that. That's just the facts,
He also shared an image endorsing the relocation of Israel to the United States as a way of solving the Israel-Palestine conflict.
What that is a GIF that went round on the internet saying, we could put Israel in the middle of the United... if the Christian Zionists want Israel to, the Israelis to have a state, they can have one in South Dakota. And in other words, this is all, what we're dealing with here is people being very sensitive about all of these things, when in actual fact we need to be more robust about all of these things. And, it's the sort of thing they're going to say, but it's wrong.
Tony, I know you've been quite outspoken about the 7/7 London bombings over the years, and we've heard just this week, since we're looking at Boris, that he has been extremely rude and condemnatory of the this is allegedly anyway by the former London fire chief of the I can't use the words on air that he's supposed to have used against them to criticise them for the victims and the families of the 7/7 London bombings, basically saying that there shouldn't be public money spent on legal cases which look into the actual causes. What are your thoughts about what Boris has said there?
Well, first of all, has he really said that? We haven't actually got him to make a confession that he has said it.
He hasn't confessed, but the former London fire chief who was in meetings with him at the time, Coleman. That's what he said in last weekend's Daily Mirror.
So if we take that as true, then it was foul-mouthed tirade that he actually spoke on the inquest, and as you're right, it's unrepeatable on air. He has got form previously for 7/7. In 2014, on the very same day that those abominable monuments, the 52 steel girders that are in Hyde Park, they were daubed with the truth. Blair lied, thousands died.
When you say the truth, what do you mean by that? And what was said?
those monuments were daubed hours before the ceremony that was supposed, the memorial service was to be taken place. And at the time, Boris was the Mayor of London. So he spoke out in condemnation. He said, "I'm shocked and saddened by this incident. It is completely unacceptable, and the Metropolitan Police is already investigating. I am pleased that the graffiti, as he called it, was removed so quickly, and that today's commemoration ceremony can go ahead as planned." This is when all 52 girders were daubed with meaningful graffiti, talking about elements of the truth of how 7/7 was an inside job, and that the rationale for going to war overseas, and that was done as a protest, and that instead of addressing the issues of why that was done, he just condemned it and tried to relate it as this is an appalling action for the families who've suffered, when the families have suffered because of a lie, and a lie that continues.
So it was the Sunday Mirror. Boris Johnson ranted "F the families" during 7/7 bombing victims' insult. Boris Johnson's alleged outburst came when he was Mayor of London and being briefed about the cost of inquests into the 2005 London terror attacks, which killed 52 people. So he was annoyed about the cost of the inquest, so he said "F the families," allegedly. Yeah. Now, the outburst came when he was Mayor of London and being briefed about the cost of inquests. Brian Coleman, who was chair of the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority, claims Mr Johnson erupted in fury and said "F the families" twice. And a second source told the Sunday Mirror he was certain Boris used the offensive words. Another source at the meeting, though, disputed Mr Coleman's account, so there is at least some disputation of that. Interesting comments, Martin, particularly because actually a public inquiry was what the family wanted, not an inquest. An inquest is designed to investigate a single suspicious death on its own, and a public inquiry is where a group of people, a small group or whatever, die. Say, for example, if there's a train crash or something, you'll have a public inquiry. Actually, the appropriate legal procedure is a public inquiry for something like 7/7, and yet even that didn't happen.
Well, wasn't it Tony Blair who said it would be a ludicrous diversion to have such an inquiry? And of course, since we're not going to have a trial because all 4 supposed perpetrators are dead, then we don't get to investigate what happened at all. And of course, the real context for all of this is NATO intelligence services promotion of terrorism going back decades. The Gladio networks going back to the 1940s.
I mean, some people
in the 1980s.
Some people have actually made films. As you mentioned there, the Ludicrous Diversion came out. I think it was the second film that came out. There was one by somebody called BT, Anonymous, that just put together lots of bits of questionable evidence about 7/7. Yeah. And then Ludicrous Diversion came out, which was actually a very high quality, like literally network television quality documentary, which of course was never broadcast. And I suppose that's the point of these things, that somebody out there is making a documentary, but the national TV networks just refuse to broadcast these things.
Well, indeed, and there's also Mind the Gap, which was one of the things that we were involved in making. And lots of people were asking questions about this. And there's plenty of questions to ask.
In fact, one of the most important points I think that the Ludicrous Diversion film makes, it makes thousands, and I'll put a link up to that on our show page too, because it's still out there, is that we've had the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6 cases where it was an absolutely massive miscarriage of justice, and so there's no reason to believe that something like that couldn't happen with the 7/7 case too.
Well, indeed, but I think it's even more, the miscarriage of justice in those 2 cases was that random Irish people were rounded up, even though the IRA admitted that they'd carried out both attacks. Whereas the 7/7 attacks are part of what you might call a more sophisticated, in my view, a more sophisticated psychological warfare operation led from inside the intelligence services. And of course, there's plenty of other things that have gone on. That was just what happened here in this country, and it was bad enough. But of course, you've got the 9/11 attacks in the US, the Bologna bombing in 1980 in Italy, which killed 87 people, and if you're talking the Irish connection, it's the bombs in Dublin and Monaghan in 1972, which the Guard are pretty convinced were carried out by MI5 via the Grenade.
I mean, are there any other things to do with the 7/7 bombings that you think worthy of note? Because, you know, if Boris is not interested in getting to the bottom of it for the families of those that have died, it's rather worrying to think that he could become Prime Minister.
Well, I'll mention just two things. I mean, obviously, there's lots of people who have made films about this, but the first thing is that the Israeli embassy had a warning that there was going to be an attack. Benjamin Netanyahu was in the embassy that morning. He was supposed to go to a meeting. He was a finance minister. He was supposed to go to a meeting at Liverpool Street. Jerusalem Post phoned up the embassy. I don't think
he was in the actual embassy. He was in a hotel.
Yeah, he was in a hotel near the embassy, but he didn't. And Jerusalem Post phoned up the embassy. Is Bibi all right? He said, no, he's fine because we got a warning. And they actually said that on air in Israel.
And also they put it out on the Associated Press,
that's right.
Newswires.
And he definitely didn't go to the meeting. The second thing I would mention...
Yeah, I'll just add to that, because I spoke to the guy from the Sunday Herald, Glasgow Herald, who said that he'd also spoken to the press officers at the Israeli embassy, and they said actually they went on to high security lockdown around about 7:45 that morning. So that was well over an hour before the bombs actually went off. The Israeli embassy were on high security alert for a bomb attack. Now, this is supposed to be a surprise attack.
Well, I think it's what Sherlock Holmes used to call a clue, isn't it? The other thing which is I think devastating is that through investigations carried out by independent investigators who we know, Connex Rail eventually admitted that the trains that the bombers supposedly caught that morning didn't run. Now, if the trains didn't run, they couldn't possibly have been in the times and places that the official story suggests. And, of course, people think they've seen video footage of the bombers, but that was the previous week. It wasn't the actual on the day itself. In other words, if the trains didn't run, the story won't stand up. And, of course, ultimately, people who drink in pubs in West Belfast...
Well, it just means they got a different... It doesn't mean anything. It just means they got a different train.
No, but they couldn't possibly have been in the times and places where the bombs went off in that case. There was supposedly a timeline that showed exactly where they were and exactly where they went.
Anyway,
of course, other people said the bombs were under the trains. Loads of people said the bombs weren't...
Tony, I know you're one of the films that you like is also